Hello everyone, wishing you all a wonderful day. Today, we're going to discover the emotional turning point of a man who was ready to leave behind wealth, power, and the CEO title just to choose a simple life with the woman he truly loves. What could make James walk away from everything he once had? Stay with us to find out this touching story. And if you enjoy this video, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss any upcoming videos. The last light of the afternoon slipped through the old wooden window, laying thin golden stripes across the floor. In the kitchen, something fragrant bubbled on the stove, filling the whole house with a warm, comforting smell that made the place feel alive. James stepped inside with the tiredness of a long day still resting on his shoulders. But the moment he caught that familiar aroma, a small smile rose on his face without him even realizing it. "What smells this good?" he asked, his voice low and warm, carrying the kind of ease he never had at the office. Diep turned around with a ladle still in her hand. Her eyes lit up the moment she saw him. "You're home already? I'm almost done cooking. There's only one last dish left. Go sit down and rest. Don't touch anything." There was affection in her voice, but also a firmness that made him listen. She gently motioned him toward the chair, and James obeyed without protest. He sank down and watched her move quickly around the small kitchen, her hands practiced, her expression soft and focused. For a long moment, he said nothing. He only watched. Somewhere deep inside him, a strange peace slowly spread. There were no tense meetings here, no pressure, no endless calls, no carefully measured words, no heavy CEO responsibilities pressing down on his chest. Here, there was only the sound of food simmering, the soft clatter of dishes, and a woman who cared for him with all the quiet sincerity in the world. A few minutes later, Diep placed a steaming plate in front of him and smiled gently. "Eat before it gets cold." James picked up his chopsticks, but his eyes stayed on her longer than they stayed on the food. Gratitude filled him so fully it almost hurt. More than gratitude, it was something deeper, a longing he had never been able to put into words. Sitting there in that humble house, watching Diep care for him so naturally, he felt like he was finally touching the kind of life he had been searching for all along. The soft sounds in the kitchen blended with their breathing, simple and steady, like two hearts slowly learning the same rhythm. Outside, the evening breeze moved through the trees, rustling the leaves as if whispering a quiet truth. Sometimes happiness is not grand at all. Sometimes it is simply knowing that someone is waiting for you when you come home. Then the phone rang. The sharp sound cut right through the peaceful silence. James glanced at the screen. It was his mother. He answered, and her familiar voice came through, calm and warm. "I'm home, son." James looked toward the yard, where Diep had stepped outside for a moment. He took a slow breath, then spoke with a steady seriousness that surprised even himself. "I'm going to quit the company," he said. "I'm coming to live with Diep and Nye." The words left his mouth like a vow, heavy, final, undeniable. In that moment, everything inside him seemed to settle into place. Wealth, position, power, status, all those things that once looked so important, now felt hollow. He had spent so much of his life chasing the expectations built around him. But what he truly wanted was painfully simple. Ordinary days beside Diep. Shared meals, shared work, shared struggles, shared peace. There was a brief silence on the other end of the line. Then, his mother asked softly, "Are you sure?" James let his gaze drift to the little yard outside. Diep was watering the plants with quiet care, bending slightly as the late sunlight touched her face. Looking at her, he felt no confusion at all. "I've never been more certain," he said. "That life at the company, it doesn't feel like mine anymore." As soon as he said it, his father's image flashed through his mind. Strong, stern, unyielding, the man who had built an empire from nothing. The man who always believed he knew what was best. The man who had done everything possible to keep him away from Diep. James tightened his grip on the phone. For the first time, freedom and fear existed together inside him. He knew this choice would change everything, but he also knew he could not turn back. The wind passed through the yard, carrying with it the scent of damp soil and evening air. The path ahead would not be easy. He understood that better than anyone. Still, somewhere in his chest, a bright, stubborn flame kept burning. For Diep, he was willing to leave everything behind. The next morning, sunlight filtered through the thin curtains and landed across the worn wooden table in soft, pale lines. Diep had already been awake for a long time. By the time James opened his eyes, she had finished preparing breakfast. A steaming bowl of noodles sat waiting for him, sending curls of warmth into the cool air of the morning. She looked at him and smiled. "I made noodles before going to work. Come sit down, it's ready." James sat at the table, and she placed the bowl in front of him with the same care she put into everything. Then her expression turned more concerned. "You've been doing farm work a lot lately. You must be exhausted. You're not used to this kind of labor. If you push yourself too hard, your body won't handle it." James looked up at her. The morning light made her seem even gentler somehow, and for a moment he forgot about everything else. "I'm tired," he admitted, "but I'm happy. Thank you." Diep sat across from him and began talking about the new season with a spark in her eyes. "The Siamese persimmon season just started," she said. "If we buy them at 13,000 dong a kilo, ripen them, then sell them for 25 to 30,000, we can nearly double the profit. And if we pick them ourselves, the earnings could be even better." She spoke with excitement, not because the plan was grand, but because it was real. It was modest, honest, and within reach. James listened carefully, feeling a strange tenderness rise inside him. There was something beautiful about the way she dreamed, not of luxury, not of fame, but of small opportunities, hard work, and a better tomorrow built with her own hands. Then she asked him, "Will you come with me?" James hesitated for a moment. His mother had just called and said she had returned from the countryside. He set down his chopsticks and stood. "I'll go see Mom for a bit," he said. "You go water the vegetables first." Diep nodded without complaint. "All right." She did not ask him to stay. She did not press him for answers. She simply began clearing the table once he left, though a faint uneasiness lingered quietly in her heart. That breakfast had not just been a meal. It was one more proof of what existed between them. A bond made not from grand promises, but from small, steady acts of care, repeated day after day. The house felt different the moment James's mother arrived. She came in carrying bags from the countryside, her presence filling the room with both warmth and authority. After one look around, she shook her head and sighed. "This place is such a mess," she said. A house without a woman always ends up like this. James gave a faint smile and went to help her set things down. She moved around as she spoke, asking about Tet, about the recent test results, about all the things she had been worrying over. James answered honestly, admitting how anxious he had been during the examination process, terrified that something from Diep's previous marriage might come back and ruin everything. But it hadn't. Everything had turned out clear. His mother let out a long breath of relief. I was worried too. Your father kept saying you could never be with Diep because she was already married once. James nodded, his jaw tightening. But now we've gotten past that. Dad can't use it against us anymore. At the mention of his father, the atmosphere shifted. The room seemed heavier, as if invisible tension had settled into every corner. His mother looked at him for a long moment, and her heart ached in silence. James mentioned casually that he had not gone to the company much lately. It was still early in the year, work was light, and the old timber stock had not yet been used up. But she knew her son too well. She stopped what she was doing and looked at him more carefully. Is something going on with you? James did not answer right away. Outside, birds were singing in the bright morning air, but inside him, everything felt restless and unsettled. This was no longer a simple family conversation. It was the moment standing between the life he had been trapped in and the life he was trying to claim for himself. His mother sat down slowly, waiting. Her eyes were full of love, but also fear. James drew in a deep breath. Then, in a voice that was quiet but firm, he said, "Mom, I want to quit my job." His mother looked up so quickly, it was as if the words had struck her. "Quit," she repeated. "Why would you quit? And if you leave, what are you going to do?" James held her gaze. There was no hesitation in his eyes now, only a calm determination that had been building inside him for a long time. "I went with Diep to experience farm life," he said slowly, choosing every word with care. "And that's when I realized I belong there. I want to live with her. I want to become a farmer because that's where I found real happiness." His mother immediately shook her head. "No, absolutely not. Farm work is far too hard for you. At the company, you manage things. You oversee everything. You don't have to wear yourself out. Following Diep into that kind of life..." She stopped, her eyes already reddening. "It's impossible." She looked at him as if she was seeing both the man he had become and the child she had spent years protecting. "I feel sorry for you," she said quietly. "I don't want you to suffer." James lowered his eyes for a moment. Guilt pressed against his chest because he knew every word came from love. His mother had spent her whole life shielding him from hardship, wanting him to have comfort, security, and a future that would never force him to struggle the way ordinary people did. But the image of Diep rose in his mind again. Her patient smile, her roughened hands, the quiet strength she carried through every difficulty. Compared to that, the polished office, the company title, the endless expectations attached to his name, all suddenly felt distant and lifeless. "I'm almost 30, Mom," he said at last. "I want to stand on my own feet. I don't want to keep depending on Father's company forever." His mother let out a trembling breath. "But farming is exhausting, son. Look around you. The people who live that life have to endure so much hardship every single day." James moved closer and gently took her hand. "I know. I do know. But I'm happy when I'm with Diep. Even if life is hard, I'm willing to share that hardship with her. You've seen everything we've been through together." The room fell silent. His mother bowed her head, and tears slipped down her cheeks without a sound. James sat there, saying nothing for a while, because for the first time, he was not fighting against his father's authority or the judgment of the outside world. He was facing the love that had protected him most, the love of a mother who wanted to keep pain away from her child, even if that meant holding him back. After a moment, he spoke again, his voice steady but softer now. "This company, this house, all of it was built by Father. I may be managing things now, but none of it truly belongs to me. I didn't build that life with my own hands, and if I stay there, Father will never stop interfering. He will never allow me and Diep to live in peace." His mother slowly lifted her eyes to him. They were full of conflict, worry on one side, understanding on the other. James continued before his courage could waver. "I want to make my own path. I want a life that no one can control for me. Diep and I have already gone through so much together. You've seen that. You know she never abandoned me, even when things were hardest." He told her about the days spent doing farm work beside Diep, how sweat would soak through his clothes under the heat of the sun, how his muscles would ache in ways they never had before. Yet even then, his heart had felt lighter than it ever did in an air-conditioned office. Out there, every task had meaning. Every effort led to something real. At the end of the day, he could look at the land, at the harvest, at the small things they had done together, and feel a satisfaction no title had ever given him. His mother listened with trembling lips. When he finished, she let out a long sigh. "I believe you," she said quietly. "I do. But believing in you and letting you walk into a life of hardship are two different things. I love you too much to watch you suffer." James swallowed hard. His throat tightened because he understood her pain. "I know how much you love me, Mom. I've always known, but I'm not a child anymore. I need freedom. I need peace. And the only place I've found that is beside the woman I love." Again, silence settled between them. Outside, the sunlight had shifted. The day moved on as if nothing extraordinary were happening. But inside that house, everything had changed. The conversation was no longer just about a job. It was about the life James wanted to claim, and the life his mother feared would break him. At last, she wiped at her tears and said, in a tired voice, "Give me time to think. 1 or 2 days. Then I'll give you an answer." James looked at her, relief and heaviness mixing inside him. It was not approval, but it was not rejection either. He nodded. "Thank you, Mom." He stood up slowly, feeling as though some of the weight on his chest had eased, though not all of it. His mother rose too, moving toward the kitchen, as if she needed something ordinary to hold on to after such a conversation. "Sit down and rest," she said softly. "I'll cook dinner." James sat back down and watched her retreating figure. The woman who had given him everything, protected him through every storm, was now the one standing between fear and acceptance. Looking at her, he felt gratitude, sorrow, guilt, and determination all at once. The setting sun streamed through the window and stretched their shadows across the floor, long and dark, almost like a symbol of the struggle between love that wanted to protect and love that wanted to be free. Later, after the house had fallen quiet, James sat alone on the old wooden chair by the window. The sunset had turned fierce and red, washing the room in a deep crimson glow that made everything feel suspended between day and night, between the past and whatever would come next. He leaned back slightly, staring into the fading light, while his thoughts pulled him in two opposite directions. One path was clear and familiar. Stay at the company, keep the title of CEO, keep the prestige, the money, the comfort, the life that everyone around him considered enviable. Remain the son his father had raised to inherit everything. But if he stayed, he would remain inside the invisible cage his father had built for him. And as long as he remained there, Diep would never truly be safe from that control. The other path was uncertain. Leave it all behind. Walk away from the office, the family business, the legacy that had been handed to him. Follow Diep back to the fields, to a life that was simple, difficult, and honest. A life where each day began with labor and ended with tired hands and an unburdened heart. A life without luxury, but also without chains. He closed his eyes for a moment. Immediately, Diep's face appeared in his mind, her smile as she cooked for him, the bright excitement in her eyes when she spoke about the persimmon harvest, the warmth of her hand when it brushed against his. There was no greed in her, no calculation, no ambition for status. With her, life felt stripped down to its truest form. Then his father's face surfaced too, stern, proud, immovable. A man of iron will who had spent a lifetime building power, and who expected his son to walk only the road he had chosen. James gripped the armrests so tightly that his knuckles turned pale. "If I stay," he whispered into the empty room, "Father will find a way to tear us apart." His voice broke at the end, because saying it aloud made the truth impossible to escape. Leaving would cost him everything he had been taught to value: the company, the security, the position, the future his family had planned for him. And yet, in exchange, he would gain something he had never truly possessed before: the right to live as himself. A few silent tears slipped down his face. He thought of his mother again, how she had promised to think it over, how much pain she was carrying because of him. He hated being the cause of her sorrow, but even that could not shake the certainty growing inside him. Slowly, James rose to his feet. The room was dim now. The last of the sunlight had almost disappeared, and the first shadows of night had begun to gather around him. But his eyes were no longer troubled. They were clear, more resolute than ever. "I will quit," he said. The words rang softly through the room, not shouted, not dramatic, but absolute. A promise to himself. A decision that would change everything. Outside, the sun sank fully below the horizon, and darkness settled over the house. But inside James, a small light remained. It flickered quietly, stubbornly, guiding him toward the life he wanted, and toward a future with Diep.